tonight we have Bernadette Rogoff doing A Woman of Unblemished Reputation, Elizabeth Covenhoven, and the Battle of Monmouth. Bernadette is definitely a fan favorite. We love her at MCHA too. And it looks like tonight's lecture is going to have a really good turnout. I don't know if you guys know, Joe Zemla is holding the record for attendance for Historically Speaking. He's got 253. We're always trying to break that record. Sorry, Joe. So Bernadette is right behind him. She's just 20 short. So we got to get her over that 253. Maybe we'll do that tonight. Okay, so
fingers crossed on that.
I think you have a shot, Bernadette. So go ahead. You can share.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. So welcome, everyone. Thank you again. And as Dana said, if you miss it tonight, I've gotten a couple Facebook messages from many of our followers. If you're not able to see this tonight, don't worry, because Dana gets it up on our YouTube channel very quickly. So, of course, if you have trouble sleeping, by all means, it's fantastic. So just use it for that. So tonight, we will be talking about Elizabeth Covenhoven, a very ordinary woman. If it wasn't for a 48-hour period at the end of June in 1778, this would be a very short talk. I could tell you that she was born, that she got married, that she had 10 healthy children, and that she died. And that would be it. And we could all go home early. That would be it. What happened, though, is that a 48-hour period shines a spotlight on this woman. And so we can see how a very ordinary elderly woman behaved in extraordinary circumstances. So Elizabeth and her family lived in Freehold. Freehold was called at that time Monmouth Courthouse. And even though it was the county seat, it was still very small. It did have some impressive buildings. It had the little courthouse. It had St. Peter's Church. It had Old Tenant Church. And other than that, it had a lot of small farmhouses because Monmouth at this time was virtually entirely agriculturally based. So Elizabeth was born to farmers, grew up on a farm, married a farmer, and lived with her family on their farm. It's also really amazing. I've been in Monmouth County since 1992, and it still just awes me how much history is still left. Even today, you can follow the tracks of the 18th century. You can follow the tracks of the American Revolution. And that's going to be very important in the coming years because, of course, we're drawing very close to the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. I personally can't wait until 2028. I think probably every American Revolution reenactor is going to come together on the battlefield at Monmouth that June. So that's going to be outstanding. Elizabeth and William, through a series of circumstances, basically it was the death of William's father and the death of Elizabeth Covenhoven's father, that William and Elizabeth got a lot of cash, unusually so. And so they decided what to do with that cash. They were going to build a house. And so they bought property from Benjamin Cook along the Burlington Path, which was also known as the Great Path. And they built an amazingly beautiful house. It's thought that the builder might be John Davies, who was a Philadelphia housemaker, house builder. He made Old Tenant Church just a couple of years before, around 1750, 1751. And Elizabeth and William were both congregants of Old Tenant Church. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that Mr. Davies built this beautiful house for the Covenhovens. And this was not a starter house by any means. More than half of their children were grown and out of the house by the time they moved into their brand new house in 1753. They moved in with about 4 or 5 of their younger children. I think the youngest was Maria or Elizabeth, who was about 8. They also moved in with their oldest unmarried daughter, Hendricka, who was 27 at the time the family moved in the summer of 1753. But don't worry, Hendricka gets married. We'll talk about that in a little while. But you can see the red line is the original path of the Great Path, the Burlington Path. And a lot of early roads actually follow even older Native American trails. And that was the case with the Burlington Path. So when the house was first built, the front of the house faced the road. Nowadays, when you drive by Covenhoven House on Route 537, you're actually driving and seeing the back of the house. You weren't supposed to see that. You were supposed to be greatly impressed by the front facade. Now you have to pull into the driveway and walk around to see that. Their house was busy and bustling. It was a very successful farm. William is what was known as a mixed-use farm. At this point in the 18th century, there were very few farmers who were specializing in anything. One of the few farmers around this time period who was specializing was Peter Loyster up in Middletown, and he was specializing in egg farming, which was great because he actually looked like an egg. William, however, was a mixed-use farmer. He had horses, dairy cows, sheep, definitely some poultry, probably a mixed flock of chickens, geese, ducks, maybe even some turkeys, definitely some pigs. They were growing rye, wheat, barley, possibly some corn. They were definitely growing several acres of flax. And they were producing linen in the house up to the thread stage. As far as we know, they didn't have looms in the house, but they certainly had spinning wheels. So there was Elizabeth Covenhoven, her husband William, their oldest unmarried daughter Hendricka, 4 or 5 younger children, and 3 enslaved. And we'll be talking about them in a little while. It's just such a privilege to be able to walk into this house and walk through the doors that Elizabeth and William and the family walked through. You can stand in the kitchen. You can see the original woodwork. You can stand in the hallway at the bottom of the staircase where Elizabeth probably stood waiting for the British to show up right before the Battle of Monmouth. You can stand there on June 28th in the morning and watch the sun make patterns on the floor. That's exactly what Elizabeth and the British soldiers who were occupying this house saw. And it's not often that you can do that. So at the end of June in 1778, there were a lot of Covenhovens. So you have Elizabeth, who was 73 at this time. William, her husband, was 76. They had 9 living children. One of their sons, Albert, died in 1763 at the age of 39. But Elizabeth and William raised 10 children to healthy adulthood. And that's quite an accomplishment. We all know about 18th century infant and child mortality rates. We actually did a little study on that a number of years ago for another exhibition called Angels in the Household. And what was interesting was that although infant and child mortality rates compared to today were just appalling in Monmouth, compared to many other colonies and even many other counties in in New Jersey, Monmouth County was unusually healthy. Part of that was because of the good weather, temperate climate, access to good water. And you also had good medical care because you had a lot of doctors in and around the area that were trained either in New York or in Philadelphia. So you have their 9 surviving children, 10 daughters and sons-in-law, 33 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren, including brand new baby Lena, who was born on May 17th in 1778. Now, I want you to take a look at this chart and notice the red names, the names that are picked out in red. Those represent Elizabeth's family members who were actively involved in either the Continental Army or local militia units in and around Monmouth. So she had a lot of sons and 3 grandsons, including 13-year-old William, who were on the battlefield at Monmouth. So what kinds of things would Elizabeth be responsible for? As the female head of this household, William would usually take care of the livestock, the field crops, things like that. Elizabeth would take care of the house. And I think I kind of have this theory that she ran a very healthy, clean household. You don't raise 10 children to adulthood without really running a tight ship. So she would have been responsible for the garden. She would have been responsible for growing the herbs and producing the medicines, everything from tinctures to creams and ointments. She would oversee the kitchen. She would oversee any of the sewing, spinning, flax and wool processing, all of that kind of thing. But she wasn't doing this all alone. There were 3 enslaved men and women in the household, and the oldest of whom was a woman named Yana. And you see here, we were playing around with CGI, AI technology. It was really a lot of fun to do. Sometimes we would get amazing results, and other times not so amazing. At one point, every time I hear somebody talk about, the computers, AI, it's going to take over the world, I wouldn't worry too much about that, because at one point when we were attempting to design an image of what we thought Josiah Halstead might have looked like, he was the tavern keeper at another of our historic sites, the Allen House in Shrewsbury, I ended up with pictures of a very smiling, cheerful man holding a tankard with 3 thumbs. So I wouldn't worry too much about AI doing too much in the coming years. So Yana is recorded in Old Tenant Church records, and you see here we have a close-up, 1737, March 19th. Yana, a Negro wench of William Covenhoven, the son of Albert. She was professing her faith that day. She became a congregant of Old Tenant Church. And then almost 10 years later, also in March, she presented her 3 children, Mac, Cyro, and Nancy, into the community of Old Tenant Church. Cyro and Nancy continued to live in the household of the Covenhovens. We don't know what happened to Mac. He disappears. So we don't know if he died or if he was sold or something else happened. But Yana was part of the Covenhoven family household for decades, since the time she was a girl, until the time of her death. And Cyro and Nancy also were part of the household. That was a little unusual. Yana had these children, and she was able to raise them and watch them grow to adulthood and live in the same household together. And that didn't often happen. At Marlpit Hall, for example, Hannah, who was one of the enslaved of the Taylor family, was sold and had to leave her 13-year-old son, William, and her 11-year-old daughter, Betsy, behind and move from Middletown to Freehold. And I doubt very much whether she saw her children very often. But Yana was able to see both her son and her daughter grow to adulthood. So as I said, that was a little unusual. So what were the lives of African Americans who were enslaved in Freehold? We don't know a specific number of enslaved in and around Freehold at this time. Mostly Freehold farms had 1 or 2, possibly 3 enslaved. It was rare to find sort of a southern plantation setting. We have a lot of that information in our exhibition at Marlpit Hall beneath the floorboards. But the enslaved men would be working in the fields. The enslaved women would do a lot of the same things alongside Elizabeth Covenhoven, taking care of the kitchen garden, milking the cows, processing the milk. Monmouth was part of the Great Butter Belt, which stretched from Massachusetts down to Delaware. And it was a rough kind of belt of land, and it was great for growing dairy cows. And so You had a lot of Monmouth farmers producing butter and cheese and then being able to sell it to the big New York City markets. So it's kind of interesting to think that New York people might well have been enjoying cheese and butter that came directly from the Covenhoven farm. Elizabeth's favorite color was blue. And one of the reasons why this house is just so amazing is because it retains so much of its original material. I'm talking breathtaking woodwork. And one of the very rarest survivors is the blue painted bedroom. And some of you here with us tonight may have seen this room. If you have not, then when we open the house in May, I strongly encourage you to make an opportunity to see this, because you are seeing something that William and Elizabeth chose to decorate their home with. They didn't stop with the outside. They went all out with the inside too. And decorative painting was actually relatively common in the 18th century. It was a way to kind of jazz up your interior space. Wallpaper was prohibitively expensive. So a lot of homes had very simple striping or spotting decorations, stenciling. The Covenhovens went a couple of steps ahead of that. And these decorations are just beautiful. They're sort of an attempt to replicate sort of carved stone or something of that nature. It's very Baroque, very Rococo, lots of swirls and scrolls and acanthus leaves. It's just beautiful. And this is a picture of the overmantel painting. So you get a sense of the space. All the panels are painted. And the beautiful egg and dart molding, acanthus leaves, palmettos, and that just beautiful blue. And for some strange reason, William and Elizabeth decided that for their overmantel painting, they would have a painter celebrate a rare victory of the teeny tiny Dutch army against the mighty British Navy. And that took place during the Anglo-Dutch Wars in the 1600s. And there were four basic, very large, drawn-out battles. And the Netherlands won the third and I believe the fourth one. And so these ships, you can see some of them have the British flag and the others have the red, white, and blue stripe of the Dutch flag. I've often wondered why they would choose a naval battle for a bedroom scene. Not quite sure about that, but it was certainly a celebration of both William and Elizabeth's Dutch heritage. Freehold had seen some conflict during the American Revolution. It's easy to look back and think, you know, everybody would be a patriot. Not everyone was. You had many people, reasonable people, really feeling that breaking away from England was bad business. And you had just as many people in Monmouth really wanting independence. So there was a great deal of clash, there was conflict, bloodshed, murder. And in May of 1777, things started to move quickly. And at that time, General Sir Henry Clinton was appointed the head of the British forces, and his first job was to relocate well over 10,000 troops and a baggage train more than it goes from either 7 to almost 14 miles long. There are different accounts of how long this baggage train was. When I say train, I don't obviously mean an actual train. I mean a long, long line of wheeled carts pulled by either horses or oxen. Because when you're marching, you can't carry everything. And so 10,000 soldiers were carrying their knapsacks, their muskets, wearing their uniforms, and a lot of other things, foodstuffs, medical supplies, personal items from all the officers. All of that was held in the baggage train. So Clinton decided, all right, so time to move out. We're going to bring all of these troops from Philadelphia to New York. And one of the reasons that was the order was because France had come in on the side of independence. And Britain didn't want to get their troops caught in Philadelphia in case the French Navy showed up. So that was why they started marching. And Clinton could choose between two main routes. He could take them up the center of the colony, or he could take them up closer to the coastline and make a beeline for Sandy Hook, where they could board naval vessels that would sail them across the harbor to New York. And so that's what he chose to do. So it's kind of interesting to read his writings. We'll talk a little bit about Clinton. He's a very interesting character that we don't pay too much attention to, but he's the other protagonist in our story tonight. Now, this is important to know that a lot of times when you're reading histories about the British showing up in Freehold, some accounts kind of give the impression that the British sort of just showed up and everybody was absolutely astonished and Elizabeth was taken by surprise. And that could not be further from the truth. People in Freehold knew that the British were on their way for at least a week. Now, for some people who had smaller houses or maybe did not have a lot of possessions, it was not that difficult to pick up and go. But if you have a farm, you cannot pick up your barns. You can't pick up your fields with growing crops. It's a little difficult to get all your horses and cows and chickens and everything together. So people did what they could. There was absolute panic. People had no idea which way to turn. So in the Covenhoven household, it was determined, and I would love to have been a fly on the wall to hear all the back and forth and decision making. It was decided to clear out what they could and then hunker down and wait for the British. A lot of Elizabeth's neighbors decided to take whatever they could carry and go into the neighboring woods and swamps to try and avoid the British. Some people were able to take some of their livestock, whatever they could carry. When you were a woman by yourself, because remember, a lot of the heads of the households were not there. They were with the militia or the Continental Army, following along, tracking along with the British Army. So if you're a woman by yourself in your farmhouse with lots of small children and livestock, that's going to be a challenge to try and get everybody going and get everybody out of the house safely. Elizabeth decided to stay in the house. We don't know where William was. He doesn't show up in the two documents that we are basing a lot of this information on. We'll be talking about where William might have been later on. I will say that it's really important to recognize that Elizabeth may, at the age of 73, made this decision consciously, knowing that her age and status in the community was absolutely no protection. The month before, in May, a woman named Hannah Dennis was beaten and left for dead by two Hessian soldiers who showed up on her doorstep. She lived closer, I think, to Tom's River, and her husband was a captain, I believe, in a militia unit. So she was by herself with her two young children. And for some reason, the Hessian soldiers thought there was money in the house or some valuables or something. And they confronted her. And when she wouldn't tell them what they wanted to know, they used their muskets and beat her in the head. And she was left for dead. So this kind of thing was known. We don't know specifically whether Elizabeth knew about this, but she certainly knew about a lot of the things that were happening when the British Army showed up. I would love it if General Clinton had been just a little bit more forthcoming in detailing his couple of days at the Covenhoven's house. Clinton himself wrote a very extensive documentation using a lot of his correspondence and letters and diaries and so on after the war, in part to prove that his decisions had been the right ones. And just about the only thing he says about Freehold in general is this quote: "When the king's army reached Freehold, I determined to halt there for a day and look about me." No mention of the elderly woman that he confronted no mention of the house that he spent 2 days and 2 nights in. And because we don't have an actual picture, we had an artist create this representation of what we think the meeting might have looked like. And for those of you who are familiar with Covenhoven, you'll recognize that hallway. It's interesting to take a look at Clinton too, because as I said before, he's the other protagonist. It's him and it's Elizabeth Covenhoven. So what sort of man was he? He was a lifelong military man. His father and brother were both British naval men. Clinton himself chose the army, so his father got him a commission when Henry was 16 years old, and he served very honorably, had a lot of great commissions, a lot of successes. But one of his biographers called Clinton his own worst enemy because he was also very shy. And believe it or not, he actually lacked a lot of self-confidence. And so in many ways, he seems to have overcompensated. And it was very difficult to get close to him. There are some officers whose men really, really absolutely worship them and they'll follow them anywhere. Clinton was kind of spiky. It was hard to get close to him. And a lot of his junior officers didn't particularly care for him either. And there were a lot of other generals who really did not like him at all. One of them being General Howe. He couldn't stand Clinton, and Clinton didn't think too highly of Howe either. In 1772, Clinton had a real heartbreak. His beloved wife, Harriet, died relatively suddenly, leaving Clinton with 5 small children. Clinton fell into a depression for about 2 to 3 years. Some of his friends thought he would never return to the military, but he finally was able to get past it to some extent. He left his children with Harriet's parents and came to America to assume his command in May of 1778. We have 2 documents that shine this amazing spotlight on the events of this 48-hour period. One is a letter from Dr. Thomas Henderson, who was a close friend and neighbor of the Covenhoven family. And it's very clear from his writings, he held Elizabeth Covenhoven in very high esteem. The other document is Elizabeth's own deposition. Now, it's not Elizabeth's own words. It's not first person. A few weeks after the incident, Elizabeth showed up and spoke with Justice of the Peace Peter Schenck in Freehold and related to him all the things that had happened. And Justice Schenck wrote them all down. That's great. It's also important to remember that Peter Schenck was making decisions about what to include and what not to include. So, of course, you have a man in local politics deciding what's important. Elizabeth, as an ordinary farm woman, might have included lots more interesting information that we would really like to hear. And Schenck may have decided, no, I'm not going to include that. However, it still makes for amazing writing. And one of the most frightening portions of Elizabeth's deposition is this. At one point, before the British arrived, she and her household decided it's very possible the British are going to burn the house. And if they're going to burn the house, we have to make sure that they don't get everything. So they piled everything on several wagons, and everybody in the household was dragging whatever they could, chairs, tables, bed hangings, blankets, quilts, you name it, and putting them on these wagons and sending them off, hopefully to hide them. And then Elizabeth waited in what was basically an empty house. However, they couldn't get everything. And so there were still a number of dairy cows on the farm. And at one point, Elizabeth stood there and watched as ordinary British soldiers herded these cows past the windows. And she stepped out and asked them, could you please not take everything, just leave us a couple? Now, normally what the British Army would do is they were foraging. And if they came to a farm and you had some cows, say goodbye to your cows, because they were going to take the cows. One of the nice things about that is that, for the British anyway, is that you don't have to carry it. Your meat now is walking on its four legs. And so they would herd the cows, put them with the baggage train, and the cows would come along and they would slaughter them as needed. Well, they were going to kill these cows anyway, but what they did was they stopped the cows in the middle of the yard and in front of Elizabeth, slaughtered them all right then and there. And to me, that is absolutely chilling, because they sent a very clear message, a very bloody one. We're here, we are in charge, and we can do whatever we want. So Clinton shows up with his junior officers and some of the soldiers. To Elizabeth, it must have seemed like the entire British Army rode into her front yard. What's also interesting is that the British hadn't really experienced a really great hot New Jersey summer. And for all of us who have experienced all of those really great, humid, hot, brutal summers, imagine wearing wool, because that's what all the soldiers were clothed in. They were dressed in wool. The Continental Army and a lot of the militia units were told to leave their uniform coats in their baggage carts. And so a lot of them were marching in linen, so they were a little bit more comfortable. There were more casualties during the Battle of Monmouth from the heat than musket fire. So at one point, Clinton shows up and he quickly realizes, as do his junior officers, that there's nothing to sit on, nothing to eat off of, nothing to sleep in. And so Clinton himself approaches Elizabeth and addresses her face to face. I imagine that scene because I imagine Elizabeth being relatively small framed, and General Clinton was, I think, about 5'10", 5'11", so he kind of towered over her, and in that bright red coat, that must have been quite a confrontation. And he addresses Elizabeth and asks her that if she reveals the location of at least one of the wagons, so they at least had a few things to use, he promised that the house would remain in the shape it was. So Elizabeth took a gamble. She revealed the location of one of the wagons. She sent one of her quote unquote serving wenches. So it was probably Nancy who went with the British soldiers to show them where one of the wagons was. And of course, the moment the wagon got into the yard, everybody helped themselves. Elizabeth never saw anything from the wagon again, but at least Clinton had a couple chairs to sit on and a table to eat off of. And at one point, oh, we'll get to that later, but they took all the clothes too. She told Dr. Henderson later that they only had the clothes on their backs. The British officers and soldiers took pretty much everything. You could use clothes to almost as currency, because if it was men's clothes, great, you could wear them. If it was women's clothes, you could trade them or barter them down the line. And so they took everything. At one point, the next morning, Elizabeth got up early and she found out that the wagon was basically picked clean. And there are only a couple things on the ground near the wagon: a family Bible, some papers, a couple of candlesticks. And so she started to make a motion to go over and pick them up. And General Clinton had placed a guard over this pile of debris, and the guard wouldn't let her near it. So Elizabeth goes back into the house and confronts the head of the British Army. This little 73-year-old woman confronts him and reminded him of his promise. So he sent one of the junior officers with Elizabeth to go retrieve whatever she could. And she ends up right by the pile, and the officer turns to her and says, "There, you old rebel bitch, take it and be damned to you," calling her with one foot in the grave. So she bent down, made a pocket of her apron, and took everything she could and brought it back in the house because she was determined to save whatever she could. This is something that's really interesting because Elizabeth walked a tightrope. I am in awe of her ability to judge this situation. She knew that violence could erupt at any moment, but she was able to confront without being confrontational. In her deposition, it's very clear that she talks to regular soldiers, she talks to officers, she talks to Clinton himself, and she's able to get her point across, but without having anybody lose face. She doesn't embarrass them. And so violence does not break out. And yet she's able to make her point known. That's the kind of 73-year-old woman I'd certainly like to be. So early in the morning of June 28th, the British Army, who had been occupying Elizabeth's house, pack up and they get going. And of course, Elizabeth didn't know it at the time, but the Battle of Monmouth would soon break out. And I believe it was the longest battle and one of the largest artillery battles of the entire Revolution. And this is our pride and joy in our collection. It's by Emanuel Leutze, 1857. And the man was brilliant. If you have not had a chance to see this painting in person, I urge you to visit the main museum in Freehold. It's in our Freehold gallery as part of our highlights exhibition. And it is as fresh and brilliant as the day Leutze finished it. It absolutely sings, it glows. And this artist was able to condense 12 hours worth of brutal, sweaty battle into an area basically the size of a sheet of plywood. That's artistic brilliance. You can see Washington. Charles Lee is on the left there, slumped on his horse. You see Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette on the right. All the way on the far right, the man in the background underneath the white flag with that funny helmet, which is actually a European summer military helmet. That's Baron von Steuben. He was the reason why we acquitted ourselves so well on the battlefield. It's important to remember that not only was this an enormous battle for the men who were fighting it, but it was also quite a conflict for the women involved. You had women on the battlefield, such as Mary Hayes Macaulay, Molly Pitcher, many women helping out as nurses and so on. And it wasn't as if suddenly, the morning of June 28th, the British left. Towards the end of the day, a lot of the wounded started pouring in to Freehold. St. Peter's Church, just down the path from Elizabeth Covenhoven's farmhouse, became a British field hospital. Old Tennant Church, where the Covenhoven family worshiped, that became a Continental Army field hospital. So you had lots of wounded, you had dead horses, dead mules, a lot of things to take care of for days, weeks, and even months after the battle. And this continued to affect all the families, including the Covenhovens. And you also must imagine Elizabeth worrying. Not only does she have the British general in her house and her cattle are being killed and she can't get a hold of the family Bible and so on, she also has to worry about her sons and her grandsons who are actively fighting. I don't know if she knew at the time, but her 13-year-old grandson, William, was actually a drummer on the field at Monmouth. He had accompanied his father, John Campbell, onto the field at Monmouth. So one of the individuals whose document is the second that tells us about this account is Dr. Thomas Henderson. He was a lifelong Freehold resident. He trained as a physician in Philadelphia, and he worked under and with Dr. Nathaniel Scudder. Scudder was another Freehold boy, and he was the only signer of the Declaration to die in battle in the American Revolution. And Dr. Henderson was apparently very well liked and deeply respected by people in Freehold. And he seems to have had a really profound respect for Elizabeth. That comes across very clearly in this document. He apparently wrote this letter and sent it to the newspapers a couple of weeks after things had died down. His own house was burned to the ground during the British occupation of Freehold. He himself was on the battlefield. He's actually thought to have been the solitary soldier who was the first one to give Washington a warning that Washington might want to check on Charles Lee and the soldiers because things were going sideways very quickly. And instead of writing about his own loss, Henderson wrote about Elizabeth's loss. Part of that, I think, is to underscore, he wanted to underscore the readers that this was very serious, that a 73-year-old elderly woman who should have been treated with utmost respect was really disrespected and brutalized. She underwent really horrific things, and he wanted everybody to know that. Houses were burning everywhere. When Elizabeth was waiting for the British to arrive in Freehold, time must have crawled. And it also must have been quite something to be able to smell the burning of the houses coming closer and closer. Those plumes of smoke got nearer and nearer as the British Army got closer. And they were burning houses all along the Burlington Path, and Elizabeth was able to see that. We have another account from 1778, just a couple of days after the battle, about a lot of the houses that were burned. Dr. Henderson, Peter Foreman, Solomon, Covenhoven, Vanderveer, David Clayton, a number of others. The army destroyed or carried off everything. And it was really a devastation, absolutely devastating. And the timing could not have been worse. You're at the end of June, your crops are finally coming along. I remember my grandfather telling me, he was grew up on a farm in upstate New York, and he used to say, you knew you had a good corn crop when the corn was knee high by the 4th of July. Well, if the British are burning everything, you're not going to get much in the way of crops. Your dairy cows are gone. Everything that you're feeding your family and making money on is basically either destroyed or taken by the British. One house that is not mentioned, which is very interesting. Remember, we talked about Hendricka, their oldest unmarried daughter. She ended up marrying at the age of 35. That is really old in the 18th century to have your first marriage. She married John Campbell, who was also a freehold farmer. And the couple lost no time in starting a family and had 4 healthy children of their own, including 13-year-old William Campbell, who was the drummer boy on the field at Monmouth. Their house was so close to Elizabeth and William's that they could look out their windows and see each other. That's how close the house was. The Campbell house is not listed as being destroyed in any list or document. And I wonder, it's just a theory, but I wonder whether Elizabeth somehow was able to kind of throw that mantle of protection over Hendricka Campbell's house, because there were so many officers. It's very possible that they were also occupying the Campbell house too. It was just an easy stroll, a hop, skip, and a jump, really, from the Covenhoven house. So that might be why the Campbell house still stood after the British left. So here you have this map made right after the Battle of Monmouth. The blue star is the Covenhoven house, and you have the 3 orange stars, burnt tavern, burnt house, burnt house, burnt house, all the way up. And then you see right to the right of the blue star, you see the Campbell residence. That's the Campbell farmhouse. That's how close Hendricka and her family were to her parents. And then you walk up the Burlington Path a little farther and you can see where St. Peter's Church is drawn. And then you can also see where the courthouse is drawn. So it was a straight march right through Freehold. And Elizabeth was, I mean, it really is amazing that the house did not burn. So, one of the mysteries, and there are a number surrounding this whole story, is where on earth was William Covenhoven? 76 years old, and he's not in the house. Dr. Henderson does not mention him. Elizabeth's deposition makes absolutely no mention of him. So it really seems as if he was not in the house. Why was that? Well, one reason was that um, he may have been sick. There are several possibilities. He may have been sick or otherwise out of commission. If he was, Elizabeth may have wanted to make sure that he was out of the house because there was no guarantee that the British wouldn't burn it. And the last thing I think she wanted to do was worry about him and having to drag him out from a burning house. The second possibility is that they may have divided forces. Two of Elizabeth and William's children, their two youngest daughters, Elizabeth and Maria, both married with small children, they were both expecting. They were 6 months pregnant. And they also had several other children with lots of grandchildren and the great grandchildren. William may have decided to go to one of their houses and maybe help them assist in getting away or packing things up or something like that. Possibility three, which is probably the outlier of the possibility theories, is that even though he was 76, there were elderly men documented as taking up a musket and joining a battle, particularly if it was near your home. You might not be part of the Continental Army, you might not really be part of the militia, but if somebody's going to try and burn your house down, regardless of how old you are, if you can do something about it, you would. So William might have been on the battlefield. Possibility number four, and this is a possibility I had not thought of, and this was actually suggested to me by Meg Sharp-Walton, who we are absolutely delighted is the executive director of the Monmouth County Historical Commission. And she is also the curator working for the New Jersey Historical Commission, putting together a really wonderful 250th anniversary Battle of the American Revolution exhibition that's going to be traveling throughout the state. So Meg was the one who suggested this to me, and I think this possibility number four might really be it. They were working so hard to preserve all of their possessions. Well, Cyro was a possession. He was young. He was probably in his mid to late 20s. He had been born and raised in the house, so he was very familiar with agricultural practices, and he may well have had skills that made him very valuable. William may have taken some of the wagons, and he might have taken Cyro with him to prevent him either leaving with the British or being kidnapped. Not everyone who was enslaved escaped to the British forces, even though it was well known that Britain was offering freedom to anybody who did so. If you decided, whatever your motivations might have been, to stay, there are documented cases where British forces would kidnap you anyway. And so possibility number four seems to really be the most likely of where William was. It's also important to know that children were absolutely deeply affected by the American Revolution, and freehold children endured quite a bit during the Battle of Monmouth. Benjamin Van Cleve, who was actually I think a distant cousin of Elizabeth Covenhoven, her maiden name was Van Cleve. He wrote many years later about his recollections, and at the age of 5, some of his earliest memories were of running with his mother and his siblings into the swamps and woods with a lot of other townspeople trying to escape the British. And he also commented about how hot it was. It was like the hottest day ever. And then, of course, after the British left, as we mentioned, there was still so much cleanup. A lot of times when you focus on military maneuvers and you're focusing on troop movements, you focus on the British leaving and the Continental troops and the militia following them, and you kind of forget everybody left behind. And although a lot of historians do call the Battle of Monmouth sort of indecisive. There was no clear winner. I will tell you that because I'm a little partial, I will tell you that the British were the ones who left their dead and wounded on the battlefield. Clinton decided just to keep going. That was his goal. His goal was not to fight. So he picked up and left at the end of the day, and the British Army continued to move towards Sandy Hook. They left behind absolute chaos. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dead and wounded all over the farm fields, all around Old Tennant Church, all around St. Peter's, up and down the roads. You also had you had to dig graves, and you can imagine in the hot sun, you're going to have to dig those very quickly. You also had dead horses and dead mules. You're going to have to bury them too. And you have men, many of whom were mortally wounded, some of whom were lost limbs and so on, who had musket ball wounds, scratches, scrapes, keeled over from heat stroke. The women of Freehold stepped up and took care of all of these people, including the British, because when the British left, they left behind their wounded in St. Peter's Church. And for those of you who have not visited Old Tennant Church, I will suggest that you do so, because there is a long-standing story that one of the pews is not only blood-stained, but there's a kerf mark or a cut mark in one of the back pews said to have been made by an amputation saw. So Benjamin Van Cleef, again, talks about coming back to Freehold. Elizabeth, in one way, she knew what was going on because she did not leave. So she saw everything that happened. But for people who left the town and went to the woods or swamps nearby and left a town that, pretty much everything was standing, to come back to complete chaos and not know whether your house was still standing or not. Well, the Van Cleef family came back to a house that was completely destroyed. And they basically had a pig with a broken back, a yearling calf, and his father's anvil. His father was a blacksmith. And the anvil probably was left because it was too heavy for the British to take. So a couple of weeks after all of this happened, Elizabeth spoke with Justice of the Peace, Peter Skenk, and told her story. And so we have those precious words documented. And then Elizabeth steps back into the shadows again. I think a lot about the meetings between when William gets back and she meets her children again, and they come and see, how mom and dad are doing, and everybody's relating all their stories. Life goes on for the Covenhoven family. Her two daughters, Elizabeth and Maria, give birth in October, within 2 weeks of one another, adding two more Covenhovens to the family. Her daughter Eleanor, who married Benjamin Van Cleef, a different Benjamin Van Cleef, not the blacksmith. There were a lot of Van Cleefs and a lot of Benjamins. Their house was burned, and Eleanor ends up dying less than a year later. Whether or not it was as a result somehow of the destruction of her home, we don't know, or whether it was from some illness, but Elizabeth and William had to see their oldest daughter, Eleanor, pass away. Elizabeth is mentioned one last time. We don't really even know the exact day or year of her death. We think it was about 1786, and that's because that year, William Covenhoven apparently wrote a new will. And in his will, Elizabeth does not appear. Normally, when a farmer like William made his will, he would certainly make provisions for his widow. And a lot of wills, so for example, John Campbell, when he passed away, he made a lot of provisions for Hendricka, who he described as his beloved wife. And he made sure that she got 1 or 2 rooms in the family home. He made sure that his son knew that he had to provide his mother with firewood and clothing and food and even candles. And provisions like that probably were in William's earlier will. But after Elizabeth died, there was no need for that. However, when William died in 1790, two administrators of his estate walked into the Covenhoven house and made a list of everything furnishing the house: chairs, tables, kitchen equipment, plates, cups, dishes. And about halfway down the list, a bed, bedding, and bedstead called Elizabeth's. And that's the last mention we have of Elizabeth Covenhoven. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Bernadette?
Yes, I can.
Oh, that was excellent. Hold on, you
Good.
want to turn your camera so I could see you?
Oh, sure. Yeah, let me do that. Hang on here. Where
Okay.
am I? Is that it? Let's see here. Hang on here. Where am
Right down at the bottom, it should
I?
say video at the top.
I'm looking. I'm looking. There we go. Ta-da. There we go.
Ta-da.
Here I am. There. So hopefully for all of you who are still awake, maybe you have some questions.
That was wonderful. Of course they are. Okay, so we have question number one.
Good.
Ron Bennett. Hi, Ron. That was truly excellent, he says. And so his
Well, thank you
question,
very much. I appreciate that.
I don't know if you can see the questions. Can you see them?
No, I don't think I
He's asking
can.
if the grounds have been gone over with a metal detector.
Yes, yes, they have. It's important to remember that, first of all, before I get started on the questions, I really have to give a absolutely profound thank you. First of all, to Dana for always making me look good with these talks, because she's run this program for 4 years and it's amazing, and it's all due to Dana. So yay, Dana.
Okay.
And then I also want to thank board member Tom Taylor. This man is a powerhouse, and he has taken Covenhoven under his wing and has overseen HVAC, wood repair, electrical work, all kinds of things. And the house has a new life. It's because of Tom and his dedication and working with all kinds of contractors, that really is going to make sure that this house lasts another 250 years. And Tom, if you're listening tonight, I know that Elizabeth Covenhoven would be absolutely proud of you. So yes, the ground has been gone over by none other than my colleague Joe Zemla, who is an amazing archaeologist himself. And it's also important to remember that Covenhoven was a private residence and changed hands a number of times and had lots of different, looked very different when we got it in 1969, 1970. There was a front porch on it. The kitchen wing actually had a full second floor. So the house had been lived in a lot, and the grounds had seen a lot of change too. So we haven't really come across any untouched 18th century deposits. Let's
So
see.
it's someone, oh, did you say you can see the chat?
Oh, yes, now I can see the chat.
Okay.
So I think I can. Oh, yes. Okay, so let's see. Let me go all the way up. Okay. Oh, okay. So I see that somebody asked about the Paper Conservation Company. They're fantastic. They're the Conservation Center for Art and Historical Artifacts. They have a great website, and they're in Philadelphia. They actually they've conserved works for us for years. They actually conserved each and every one of our Michael Williams portraits. We used to joke with them that they should open an easy pass lane for us, and we actually have 13 documents there with them right now. About 3 of them are undergoing conservation. We're writing a grant right now for the rest. So I recommend them highly. If you have any paperwork that you need done, they can do it. Let's see. Oh, somebody answered them. Let's see. Oh, thank you. Yes, so the grounds have been gone over. And the house continues to show us surprises. Just this past month, we discovered basically spaces the size of closets behind the 2 main floor shell cabinets, display cabinets in the front parlor. We had no idea. None of us had any idea that these spaces existed. But we were able to get behind there. We found some old wallpaper that we're still continuing to date. A lot of it looks like mid 19th century up until the 20th century. We're still researching one pattern that we think may actually be late 18th century. But a house like this always has surprises. So that was the most recent one. So I'm sure there are more to come. Let's see, what other questions do we have here?
Someone's asking about
Um,
his maiden name. It was Van Cleef, right?
yes, it was Van Cleef. Yes. Her father was named Benjamin. So Benjamin's a name that you see over and over in the Covenhoven family. Um, so I see, has Elizabeth's death record never been located? I was not able to find it. We believe I think she's buried with William, and I believe they're both in Old Tenant Church, churchyard, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see. Oh, thank you. Somebody said we are marvelous. You and I are marvelous, Dana. That's very nice. Thank you. Um, yeah, that's a good question too. I am wondering how in the world the British were able to carry off the furniture and belongings. Aha, that's where the baggage trains come in, because you have all of these wagons that were driven by, usually they were called carters or cartmen or wagoneers, and they would be driving these wagons pulled either by oxen or horses. And that's how you could carry away a lot of this stuff. So if you saw a little, tea table that took your fancy and you thought it was really nice, put it on the wagon. They'll take it for you. That's how the officers could take a lot more personal belongings than regular soldiers. So they had all kinds of things on the wagons. Let's see. Oh, somebody is related to Elizabeth. That's great.
We got a lot of people related to Elizabeth.
Well, you know what? We're not surprised, are we? With 10 children, 33 grandchildren, and I stopped counting in June of 1778. So she had, I don't know how many great grandchildren, and you keep going. So a lot of Covenhovens in the area.
Yeah, a lot of cousins on this Zoom right now.
Oh yeah, we like that. We like that. Um,
And yes, the Covenhovens are the modern Conover family. Someone's
yes,
asking.
that's right. Yeah, there were some, and it was basically Elizabeth's children's generation. A lot of them decided to anglicize their name from the Dutch Covenhoven to the English Conover, but some in the family kept the Covenhoven name. And then you also have to remember that Elizabeth's husband, William, he had a lot of brothers and sisters too. And his father had lots of brothers and sisters. So there were cousins all over the place. Um, how many acres did they own? Is the Campbell house still standing? I think Joe was poking around the barn that's still standing, right? Isn't that oh no, the Campbell house, no. Hendricka's and John's house is not standing. That is no longer standing. That was probably a much smaller house. Um, I know the barn, I think, of Dr. Henderson's house is still standing. And that's up on a little hill overlooking Walmart on Route 537 right now.
It's just
They
it's been so
owned
convenient.
I know it's very convenient. You can go in and yeah, do some shopping and then go look at the barn and so on. So it's great. And supposedly some of the Dr. Henderson's foundations, the foundations of his house, part are still partly there too. So we think Elizabeth is buried at Old Tenant Church, and I think it was at least 300 acres, at least. And then I think William also owned a woodlot. That was also kind of a fun fact. A lot of farmers would own separate woodlots because, of course, you needed firewood to heat your houses. And where are you going to get the wood from? You're going to own a couple acres of wood where you can go in and cull the wood and season your firewood so you have enough to keep your house warm. Let's see. Yes, that's right. Okay. Okay, how did you discover, research the information about Elizabeth Covenhoven, and what documents did you research? Well, technically we only have the two. We have Dr. Henderson's letter to the newspaper, and then we have Elizabeth's deposition. A lot of this is theory. which is a fancy historical name for guessing. And if you take what you have and a knowledge of human nature, and then a good general strong background of social culture and women's history and farming, agricultural history, and so on, you can put it all together and draw some reasonable conclusions. And also, my video games are ancestry.com and newspapers.com. And between the two of them, and the excellent work by a lot of genealogists long before me, we were able to put together all of the Covenhovens family. Fortunately, Old Tenant Church kept excellent records, so we have all the baptisms of their 10 children on record, and all of that's available on Ancestry. And William's original will and his estate inventory, the original documents, are at the State Archives in Trenton.
Someone is asking, are donations being accepted for the Covenhoven house? They definitely are. We definitely need them, right?
Yes. Oh, yes.
So if you go
Yes.
to the donate page, if you go to our website, monmouthhistory.org, and you click on donate, I think you could put in a little note that you want it, where you want it allotted to. And if it doesn't give you that, then you can just email one of us and we'll make sure that it gets into the right bucket.
Yeah. This is an extraordinary survivor. And I love Elizabeth's story, because you don't have to be 20 years old and a brazen hero. You can be 73 years old and you can still go head to head with the head of the British Army and save your house. And that's one of the things I love about history, is that the most unlikely people can step forward and show courage. I just love that. Absolutely love it. I'll also mention that we are, once we finish all of the construction and restoration work, we are opening a new exhibition at Covenhoven House, and it's called Choices. And we talked a little bit about a lot of choices that people were making during the Battle of Monmouth. And so we're going to be exploring those in much greater detail in the house. The first floor is remaining as historic interpretation. We also replaced the hearth beam in the kitchen, so we'll be starting up demonstration cooking again. And the exhibition will be in 2 smaller rooms. And that'll give a nice context about the Battle of Monmouth, about the American Revolution, and about the choices everybody from Elizabeth Covenhoven to Yana, her daughter Nancy, and her son Cyro were making at this time.
Do we have any more questions? Someone's asking about her last name. He had her last name, her maiden name, as Aumack, which is definitely, it's a Monmouth County name, but it's not Elizabeth's maiden name.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, the name Aumack, I don't remember doctor's appointments, but if you've been dead 250 years, I remember your name. The beautiful blue and white painted cos that's on view at Merlepit Hall is said to have come from the Aumack family, and then into the Loyster family when Annie Aumack married a Loyster.
Yeah, they go way back.
Oh yeah, the cow kicked the oven over. No. The short answer is no, because if you think about it, oh, we don't have a surname, we don't have a last name. I wish we could come up with one. Oh, what happened? The cow just kicked the bucket over, and now we have a last name. No, it's always fun to read early histories of Monmouth County, because you have a lot of these kind of fun and interesting stories that are not true. And where Elizabeth's story is concerned, several early Monmouth histories talk about the esteemed Mrs. Conover. She wasn't calling herself Conover at that time, and never did. She was always a Covenhoven, buried her silver under the rose bushes and so on. And there's that, again, is sort of like Washington chopping down the cherry tree kind of thing. These stories kind of develop over time. So that about the cow kicking the oven over, no. Let's see.
Elizabeth's deposition is at the State Archives, correct?
Yes, that's true. And
Yep.
Yeah, I think we have it transcribed too, so maybe we'll put that online somewhere, and that's definitely going to be included in the Choices exhibition too.
No,
Um, and again, it makes it's really interesting reading. I wonder what other things she said to Justice of the Peace Peter Skank, who decided that that's not important. That's trivial. I'm not going to write it down.
right.
Let's
We have
see.
someone asking, has there been any research done on the enslaved Black people's descendants in the household? So yes, I'll let Bernadette take that.
That's yeah, we have this is part of our overarching living and breathing program. The first house to be reinterpreted to tell everybody's story. You don't you start to leave stories out, and it's like a book that you tear chapters out of, and then you don't get that full richness. So everybody's story, you want to incorporate everybody's story because that's what makes history so amazing. Um, we we have tried. I don't think we've identified anybody who can trace their lineage back to Yana and Nancy and Cyro. Yana seems to have died either before or around the same time as Elizabeth Covenhoven, because she is not mentioned in William Covenhoven's will. His will does make provision for some of the other enslaved, and this is when they get split up. So they've grown up in the same household all these years, and once William dies, they're parceled out to the other adult children. And so Cyril goes to one. There are also two other enslaved, Hercules and another young man named Bros, and then Nancy, and they're all farmed out to other households. So we, as far as I know, we have not been able to identify anybody yet. But that would be
So
wonderful if we could.
Jean is saying, she said, where can I listen to this talk? I missed most of it. I'm in Hawaii. You know, Jean, you're in Hawaii. I don't think we need to. That's not fair. I'm not going to tell you where you can see this talk. No, you can see this talk on our lecture page. If you go to our lecture page, it's under previous lectures. Give me about 2 days to get it edited and put up on our YouTube channel, so you could see the whole thing there.
Another really amazing thing that everybody has to come see is the living portrait, the speaking portrait that will be part of it's brand new technology. It's all Dana. Dana did this whole thing. And you will be able to hear and see Elizabeth Covenhoven come alive and tell you the story. So that's going to be really cool. So you definitely have to come
Terrifying.
see that. Right?
That sounds terrifying, actually, when you say it that way. So
Let's see. Yes,
yes,
Van Cleef.
yeah, he was the blacksmith who made the hardware at Tennant Church. Wow, good for you. Yep, that
Oh,
was him.
yes, he was. Yeah, he was. Yeah, and I completely agree. This is an excellent question. More research needs to be started to tell the enslaved stories. It's interesting because, and we get into this a lot more in the Choices exhibition, that because this 48-hour spotlight shines on Elizabeth, it also shines on Yana and Nancy. So you have Nancy interacting with British soldiers. She is probably the one who showed some of the officers where the wagon was. And Elizabeth's deposition talk about, and so does Dr. Henderson's description of the events. Both of them talk about her serving wenches, Yana and Nancy. They're never named, but we know who they are. Were with Elizabeth. They were standing right behind her when General Clinton walked into the house. If the house burned, they didn't have a roof either. And they were the ones who slept with Elizabeth. She didn't get to sleep in her bedroom, by the way. She did sleep on the milk room floor without a coverlet, as she said. They didn't even give her a blanket. And Yan and Nancy were with her all through this. So they also saw all of this happen. And you sometimes read this and you start to get this sort of protective feeling. But I never want to try and read the mind of someone like Yana or Nancy, because they certainly had their own hopes and dreams and thoughts and certainly fears at this time as well. So we do explore that a little bit more in the Choices exhibition. Let's see. Glad everybody liked it. That's good. George Washington did not, this is one of the few places he did not sleep. He did not sleep in the Covenhoven house. I have no idea. I mean, he was in Freehold. Pardon?
That would have been
I didn't
awkward.
hear you. Yeah. General Washington, I'm so sorry. We have no bed for you. I'm terribly sorry. One of the things that I love, though, if you think about it, Clinton was sleeping in the blue bedroom. And so here's the head of the British Army falling asleep, looking at that overmantel painting, which shows the victory of the Netherlands against Great Britain. And I always wondered, I wonder what he thought about that. Yeah, absolutely. It was a gritty time. It was a very gritty time. I think we are done with the questions then. I think that's it. Thank you so much, everybody. I always like to hear all the questions and comments because that means that people were paying attention. So I always like that. So. Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
All right.
And we'll see you. I think it's May. It's in May. Look at our lecture page. We have John Barrows. He's one of another fantastic presenter, and he's doing, it's called The Priest and the Pirate, and it investigates Blackbeard's raid on Middletown. So that's going to be
sounds
awesome.
good. Plus, he has the best voice ever.
Yeah, Radio John. I nicknamed him.
His voice. I could listen to him read the phone book.
He's so professional. Well, you too.
Yeah.
You're
it's fantastic.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much.
All right.
Have a
Good
good
night,
night.
everybody. Thank you.